Good morning all. Welcome to YouGov's COVID-19 consumer behaviour update and our launch of our economic recovery tracking. My name is Will Alstein. I'm a commercial director at YouGov, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Amelia Brody, our UK head of data products. Morning, Amelia. Are you on the call?
Hi, Will. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So what we are going to be talking about today is, I'll give a brief overview on YouGov's work on COVID-19, how we are partnering with academic institutions and helping to serve the public good. What I'll then go on to talk about is just some of the headlines from our connected data, not related to our consumer monitor, but other questions that we've got sitting in YouGov's data vault. We're then going to move on and talk about the insights from our COVID-19 consumer monitor, which Amelia will run through. And then I'm going to talk about the new data that we're collecting in terms of economic recovery. We'll then very briefly touch on future developments that you can expect from YouGov, and then get on to a whole series of questions, hopefully from you, the audience. On questions, there is a chat function within Zoom here. If you could please note your questions down in that chat as we go. And Amelia and I will look at those and we'll come back to them all at the end and try and get through as many of them as we possibly can. Okay, let's get started. Talk about YouGov's work. YouGov's priority right now, as determined by our CEO, is very much helping to serve the public good. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is we're giving everybody who wants it the opportunity to contribute to the discussion, to have their voice heard, and then delivering data around that conversation to those organizations, be they public health, be they policymakers, who can really make a difference in helping to fight this disease. And when we talk about giving everyone the opportunity to contribute, we are using the full spectrum of YouGov's communication tools with the general public. So whether that be traditional online surveys with our panel or open source chat using our latest technology through an acquisition that we made around in Convo. We don't need to panelize people, it's just a free-forming chat that sits within there. In terms though of our academic partners, which I referenced at the start, we've partnered with the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. It's these guys at Imperial College that are informing much of SAGE's modeling, and together what we've been creating is a huge raft of behavioral data that policymakers around the world are looking at. Our data is being delivered through dashboards that are offering organizations such as the World Health Organization access to a plethora of data on which they can base their evidence and decisions. We've also, for the first time, I believe in YouGov history, made that data open source. It is now available on GitHub for anyone that would like to access it. And I've provided a link in here. You can already see a first question coming in about, will this presentation be shared? Yes, it absolutely will be. So don't worry about scribbling down these links or taking copious notes. We will share a copy of this presentation afterwards. But in terms of how that public data is then being used by organizations, known as CAP studies, knowledge, attitude, and behavior, our surveys and data allows communicators to understand how the population thinks, feels, and most importantly, its readiness to comply with the guidance that is laid out by governments. Like any marketeer or marketing function within a business, the same is true of government in this situation. They've got to better understand the audience to develop better communication strategies to affect change. And crucially, deliver any communications in a way that is the population can understand and ethically nudges them towards meaningful behavior change. And in terms of what that public health data includes, it is very much focusing on what the scientists need and about stopping the spread of the pandemic. And at the moment is, of course, heavily influencing what the exit strategy from lockdown is likely to be. So our study covers things like symptoms, people's appetite for testing, whether they would be willing to self-isolate, how many people that they come into contact with if they go outside the home, and things around personal compliance with things like hygiene, etc. That study is being run across 29 markets with about 30,000 surveys completed on a weekly basis. And we're delivering a whole raft of outputs through our partnership to public health organizations, including one-pagers like you're seeing on the screen there. So if that's our data that we're delivering to public health organizations, what we're also making available from YouGov is what we're calling our public data. So this is data taken from our commercial trackers that we are putting a selected elements of out into the public domain. You can see all of it on our website at yougov.com/free COVID-19 tracker. And that data at the moment spans things around fear of contracting the virus, some behavior and compliance with government measures, perceptions of how well the government is coping with the pandemic. And we will soon be adding a couple of variables in there in terms of our economic recovery piece. The data that is on our website is interactive. You can cut it by country, one of the 27 that we're running this in. You can cut it by geographical region as well. For our subscribing clients, and I know delighted to see a huge number of them on our call today, we have also enhanced our data products, so specifically profiles and brand index, enabling you to understand the impact of COVID-19 on your audiences and on brands. So the level of concern question has been added to all sectors in brand index, and our public data points have also been added to profiles so that you can explore those audiences. If you do need help in understanding that or accessing that data, then please contact your local account team. But let me just talk about the data that we're going to walk you through in the latter part of this presentation. And they're drawn from our COVID-19 consumer monitor tracker. This consumer monitor tracker goes beyond our public data offering and offers greater depth. It's delivered on a weekly basis inside our Crunch tool, and clients are buying into this on a 8-week basis. We're running it in 8-week blocks to give us the flexibility to change tracking as we have done for our second block that we're going into. But also it doesn't overly commit clients to a period of a subscription. And we have priced it incredibly competitively so that we, one, don't profiteer, but also it allows us to cover the costs of the work that we're undertaking for public health organizations. And let me talk about the consumer monitor and the questions in block 2 that we are launching this week. For those of you who subscribed to our block 1 data that came to an end last week, we have changed the questionnaire slightly. It's an evolution, not a revolution. But for example, we have retired the "Are you aware of coronavirus or COVID-19?" That was nearing 100%, not a very useful metric anymore. So what we have done is retire that and replace with alternatives. So the block 2 questions that are being released at the end of this week will include levels of concern with maintaining changes in spend, feedback from clients found that very useful, and we're also keeping media consumption. There's a couple of things that we're adding to this that are as a result of feedback from our clients. In particular, we'll be monitoring trust in government, in media, in healthcare professionals, and we're also including elements on travel plans. The economic recovery questions, which we're offering as an additional bolt-on subscription to our consumer monitor, looks again at 3 broad areas, and I'll walk you through these with some example data that we've collected in the last couple of weeks. And that looks at consumer confidence and the outlook. So people's view of the global economy, of the local economy, understanding the household financial situation now, or the change in it in the last month, but also a forward-looking measure into the next 12 months. We're also looking at employment, so perceptions of job security, level of business activity, and any changes around individuals' employment. And then again, a forward-looking piece, again responding to client feedback here, saying what are the new habits that consumers have either learnt under lockdown and will be sticky in the future, or are likely to happen. So we've covered a raft of them there, and we'll finish with that at the end. Just a brief piece on timing to cover all those monitors. We are now entering our second block of 8-week periods. That started on Monday and will run until the 26th of June. Towards the end of that block, what we will be communicating is what we intend to do in our third 8-week block. What we're also doing for those of you that are subscribing to global data is we're bringing all of our markets into line. APAC started about 3 weeks ahead of everywhere else. So what we're doing is just making sure that we bring all of those markets into line for ease of analysis for our clients. Right, that's enough of the background and context to what we're doing. Let's get straight into some data. So what I'm going to lead off with is just a couple of fast facts from what we've seen from our connected data. Some of them very worthy, some of them a little more frivolous. But we have been tracking for some time now what people consider the most important issue facing our country. And as you can imagine, for a long time, Brexit was dominating the agenda. But that is no longer the case. The state of the nation's health and the economy by far have overtaken Brexit as the most important issues that we're facing. There's a big debate about lockdown at the moment. On the 1st of May, we ran a question asking people whether they supported the further extension of lockdown beyond the 7th of May. We're all waiting with bated breath in the UK of what Boris is going to say on Sunday. 78% of the population do support further lockdown of some kind beyond that date. It's interesting to see data behind this, but we have seen a significant upturn in the amount of exercise that people are doing. Whether that be getting out of one of their daily exercises out of the house, or whether that be participating in yoga classes, PE classes, or whatever it might be inside the house. However, what we have seen in the last week or so is a slight increase in those saying that they are not doing any exercise whatsoever, suggesting that enthusiasm is beginning to wane. There's also been a lot of speculation in the press about a coronavirus or COVID-19 baby boom. From what our YouGov data suggests, that looks unlikely, as the numbers of time or the amount of sex that Brits are having has not increased in any way, shape or form, as our data would suggest. I also saw another survey from one of our competitors that was published last night that corroborated this fact as well. However, it could be potential for more separations as greater strains are being put on relationships. 25% of our population says that they are under more strain with those that they are living with, and that rises to about a third of people where there are children in the household. However, we Brits are stoic, and the overwhelming majority of people believe that we are coping well with the existing situation. I can tell you that, that half of the population is coping by baking or increasing their baking. And a slight topical one looking ahead to Friday is that over 2/3 think that we should be celebrating VE Day, and that would be a good national exercise to get out and celebrate. But I did think it was quite interesting. Of those using video call technology, we've got about 38% who said it's much harder to get your point across on a video call. So I'll take that on board. Amelia will take that on board as we try and deliver our message here. So that's just a couple of instances of some of the data that we've been seeing from our connected data. All of this you will see in our profiles tool. But what I want to get onto is our COVID-19 consumer monitor, and I'll hand over to Amelia to walk us through that.
That's great. Thank you, Will. Just a couple of questions that have come up from attendees while you were chatting that would be good to address as we go into the COVID-19 monitor update. So we've had a couple of questions around doing year-on-year comparisons. So the COVID monitor in particular has just been running for this 8-week block. So we don't have questions from 12 months ago that are exactly the same to compare it to. But because our profiles and brand index data sets are continuous data sets, and we were absolutely collecting data around these topics, such as exercise, such as sexual behavior, around this time last year, we can compare it to what we were seeing then. But one of the differences with the COVID-19 monitor is we're asking questions that are specific to how people are responding to the current situation. So that makes it a little bit of a different kind of question, and obviously not one we were asking last year. There were also a few questions around the sample, which I will go into a little bit more detail on, and also the lowest level of geography the outputs go to in the UK. And those questions are a little bit connected. So Will, I think if we pop to the next slide, it's just got some of the methodology details. So you can see there, this is the number of waves that we've done for the COVID-19 monitor, and under the column N, you can see the sample. So we've been running that out to just over 2,000 of our panelists each week. That's a nationally representative sample within that 2,000. Now, our ability to cut that by geography into regions, even as far as postcode, that ability grows as we build up that sample. So when we're looking at 2,000 people, we can probably give quite a nice read on what are the differences between England, Scotland and Wales on some of these points of view. But by wave 7 and wave 8, we're really looking at a sample size that's big enough to cut that by a much smaller region. And that's absolutely something that is enabled through the crunch deliverable that we actually give the data to you through that mechanism, and also if it's connected to profiles data, it gives you more ability to do that as well. So there's absolutely more options to cut the data down beyond this, and this is really why we focused on building up this robust sample over time, because it gives us so many options in terms of how we can actually look at the data going forward as we see the situation developing and understand what's important to our clients and to the general public as we go along. So we'll dive into the monitor itself now. And what we've done here is really looked to give you a snapshot of what has happened in this last 8-week period. How have things changed over this time, and what are some of the biggest swings we've seen in behaviour? And so we're looking here at the level of concern and how that's progressed over the time that we've been tracking. And it's really reflecting the commentary that the UK has passed the peak in numbers of people contracting the virus. And so we see that the number of people, therefore, that are scared about contracting the virus is also starting to fall. Absolutely not back to levels of early March, but definitely what we saw at the end of March, early April, was really the height of the level of concern, and that the biggest impact on people's behaviour resulted from that. And what we're seeing now is a kind of tapering in that. When we start to then look at it on the next slide by age group, we can see some stark differences. So young men have experienced consistently lower levels of fear throughout this period. I think it's quite interesting that while they experience lower levels of fear, never once those 18 to 34-year-olds crossing over into that kind of net scared territory, that the shape of the curve is very similar across the different age groups. So while they didn't feel fear as a group, males aged 18 to 34 in the same way that, say, females over 55 did, it was the same events that were making them reassess their feeling or driving their levels of concern. It's just how it impacted them personally made them respond differently. But I think what we're seeing here is we're having a very similar experience, it's just at different levels. When we move on then to how is this feeling of concern and fear actually impacted people's behaviour. When we first started talking to our panellists about this, we saw that most of the impacts on behaviour were still ones that didn't actually impact their day-to-day lives that much. So improving personal hygiene, refraining from touching objects, avoiding contact with people who seem to have the flu. Most of these things are things that people do anyway, and what we saw at the beginning was just an increase in these types of behaviour. By the end of the 8-week block, what we see is that the number one measure being taken, avoiding crowded public places, and the number 3 measure, avoiding travelling, are measures that have a really big impact on people's lives. So over this 8-week period, the behavioural change that we've seen is huge, in that we've seen people go from making small changes that didn't really inconvenience them to really changing how they go about their day-to-day life. And that's really tracked along with how concerned people have been feeling about the impacts of the virus. The changes that people are making to their day-to-day lives, though, are also kind of in conjunction, sorry, keep going, Will, in conjunction with how the government has been advising us to act and behave. So in that first wave, we saw there was not a strong government guidance around lockdown and staying home, whereas by wave 3, the messaging that was coming down was very different. And we saw that there was difference in how people felt about what the government was saying, and that correlates quite well with their level of concern. And so as that level of concern has dropped off, we've also seen the support of the government, or how well we feel the government is handling the situation, has also dropped off. And the difference between wave 3 at 72% of people thinking that the government is doing well or fairly well, and 58%, that's a significant difference. So we have seen a changing mood amongst the public in terms of their support of the government, and it's In line with the virus being perceived as being post-peak, the government support is absolutely post-peak now as well. But how does this kind of what people are thinking and feeling in general about the virus, how does that translate into how they're thinking and feeling about their leaders and how the country has actually handled it? And so UK here is doing better than some. And so we see here that Brits think that Boris's handling of the crisis is well above that, of the perception of the way that Trump has handled the crisis. But we are seeing consistently that countries such as the UK and the USA are perceived to be handling it a lot worse than some other countries. And some of those I think people do find quite surprising. So this is something I think that is really also impacting how people feel about Boris's handling of the crisis, is they have these comparison points of other governments, how are other countries handling it, and unfortunately the UK is not coming out very well when we look at that. What we're seeing then is the support for government institutions has changed throughout this period. We've seen the support in the government peak and drop down. However, the support for the NHS has really just continued to grow over this time. So the public confidence in the NHS is now at an all-time high. And I think, you know, recent stories around the Nightingale hospitals being put onto standby and so on, I think is really helping to drive that message that while the government might be struggling in certain areas, that the NHS has really responded to the outbreak in a way that has instilled confidence in the public. So that gives us a good snapshot of how people are thinking about coronavirus, how they're thinking about the government and the NHS, but how's that actually impacting what they do on a day-to-day basis, and how's it impacting our consumer behaviour? Unsurprisingly, it's impacting consumer behaviour a lot. We've seen a lot of changes in spend, and we see this is very variable when we look across categories. I think it's unsurprising that there'd be an increase in grocery spend. I mean, focus group of one here, but my grocery spend has gone through the roof in the last couple of months. And some of the other areas, though, that I think are more surprising is when we have a look at, on the far right-hand side, clothing, we have 57% of people saying that they're actually spending less on clothing. Now, while something like our external entertainment spend, you know, will be curtailed by what's happening at the moment. We can't go out and spend money in theatres, concerts, and so on. Our ability to buy clothes online has not been hampered, but you know, the mood is that we're not spending on those types of things, and we've seen that continuously over this period. This continuous trend of people spending less across all of these categories. If we move on to the next slide, and this is just kind of focusing in on grocery, and again, grocery, like a lot of the other metrics, we've seen a big increase around that kind of late March period, but things have evened out over the most recent weeks. So grocery spend week on week is still growing, but it does seem to have slowed down a bit. And I think that depending on, you know, the news that comes out this weekend and what the plan is over the next couple of months will really impact how people are continuing to spend in the grocery space, or whether they think their endless cycle of cooking and washing up might be soon coming to a close. So we do expect there to still be significant spend in grocery, but we don't expect it to necessarily keep growing at the way that it did in early March. Then if we move on to the next slide, which is looking at change in online spend. And I think this is really quite interesting. So when we look at the week commencing the 12th of March, we had 80% of people saying they hadn't changed their online spend at that point. And we had a further 13% of people who said they didn't spend online, so it wasn't an applicable question to them. If we look at the week commencing the 23rd of April, so we're looking about 6-7 weeks later, the number of people who said that they haven't changed their online spending has reduced to less than 30% of people. And we've seen that those who are spending more is around 20% of the population, and then those who are spending less is that further 40%. And we've had people move from that not applicable, I don't spend online category, into one of those categories. So the behavioural change in terms of spending online that's happened over the last 6 to 8 weeks has been huge. And I would say most consumers have changed in some way, whether it is spending more or spending less. It's definitely the minority whose spending patterns haven't been impacted at all. When we then go on to take a little bit more of a look at those who say they are spending more, what are they spending it on? They're spending it on groceries. So again, we see groceries as the #1 category where kind of any additional spend has been going in the last couple of months. We do see, however, though, that those who are spending more online are a little bit more confident about spending in other areas as well. So, you know, we saw in general that there was around 3% of people, I think, who said that they were spending more on clothing. Whereas when we look at those who are just open to or have said that they're spending more in general, we see that that number jumps up to 20%. So there is absolutely still a segment of people who are spending, but it is a small segment, and you need to look to find them, and they're not spending equally across all segments. So in terms of that picture, where we will keep tracking that over time, and all of this data can also be crossed with our other data around brand index and profiles to start to give more of a detailed picture of who these people are, and if you need to reach them, how you can potentially do that. So if we move forward to the next slide, we're now looking a little bit at media and entertainment. So the second biggest category of spend amongst those who are spending more online is entertainment. Again, one of the things that you can spend on at the moment in entertainment, streaming services. We've absolutely seen a response to that from streaming services in terms of them bringing forward release dates of content and moving schedules around to try and take advantage of the captive audience that they've got. And so we've seen that people across the board are accessing news and entertainment more often, but even just since the beginning of this tracking period, so that early March period to the end of April, we've seen that there's been a really big shift with the first part of our tracking in early March really showing that there was that huge group of people searching for news online. And while that did grow between the beginning of March and the end of April, what we are seeing is it's not growing in the same way as entertainment or escapism is. And so again, this is something where we do see a real opportunity, and obviously the streaming services have seen that opportunity as well, but as people are looking to take a break from what's happening in the day-to-day, they are really looking for as much entertainment as they can consume. So that kind of just gives us a little bit of a snapshot into how people are thinking and feeling, and how the sustained period of concern people have had about the virus has impacted on spending, accessing entertainment and news. What we are seeing over this time is that these things are really continuing to develop, and the changes that we've seen between the first week and the last week have been really significant. And so what we're doing now is starting to build out some more data around what will that economic recovery look like. So I'm going to hand over to Will now, who can go into some more information that builds on the picture of the consumer and starts to look towards the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amelia. So let's just have a brief note on the economic recovery monitor and some fieldwork dates that we're looking at. Formally, our fieldwork started from on the Economic Recovery Monitor, and the data that will be released from to clients will be collected this week and will start being delivered from Friday. However, what we have done in the last couple of weeks is run some test waves of this to build up a baseline, and it's from this data that I'm going to give you a short summary of to show what the population is feeling. So, some headlines here, and some of this doesn't make comfortable reading as we would expect. But a third of households claim that they are in a worse financial situation now than they are last month. I think it's a surprising amount that I would expect that say there is no change, but there is, of course, those that do say that they are in a better place. But their outlook for their own financial situation is more of a mixed bag. There are some optimists in there. There are some people, about 1 in 5, that say they don't know how it's going to change. But there's still a third saying that, well, it's actually going to get worse over the next 12 months, and a similar third saying that then they don't expect any change in their household situation. I think if we'd ask this question today or tomorrow, as a result of the Bank of England's warning this morning, the Bank of England warned of a 14% contraction in the economy based on their scenario with a lockdown being eased between June and September. With that dominating headlines today and tomorrow, I think the answers to this question would likely change. We ask about people's job security. And what there's a number of questions that we ask here, 2 of them that I'm showing on screen at the moment. We ask whether people have been affected or their status of their employment has been changed. We're currently tracking furloughed employees at about 19 or 20% of workers. But about a third of people are saying that they are feeling less secure in their role. But I think the more worrying sign is that around 50% of employees saying that they have seen a reduction in the level of activity at their place of employment. So the job market doesn't look particularly a welcome place for candidates right now. In terms of, so if that's where consumers see themselves in terms of their household situation and their job, how is that impacting what they're doing? And what we're seeing is a large number of people actively reducing non-essential expenditure. For those who are in a worse financial situation over the last month, that increases to a majority. But we're also seeing a third of those people rely on savings, and a not insignificant proportion of them looking at taking on more debt to cover their expenses. And in terms of the outlook for the UK economy, again, 2/3 of people saying that in 12 months' time, they think that we are likely to be in a depression or a recession. But we also go on to that and said, well, what are you most concerned about? Is it a global recession? Is it local businesses being unable to recover from this situation, banks failing, paying bills or rent? And what we're seeing is that most people are concerned about a global recession, but also concerned for their local business. And that is actually reflected later on, as we'll see, in how people are going to behave. In terms of paying rent, down at 30%, that does increase to about 40% amongst Londoners. Not entirely surprising given the income versus rent ratio that Londoners experience, but it's certainly one to watch and doesn't make pleasant reading for landlords in that situation. We have run these early waves of data in the UK, in the USA and Germany, and I've just included some of the benchmarks here in terms of looking at that same question. So what are people most concerned about? And if you compare the Brits versus the Americans versus the Germans, well, the Brits are more concerned about local businesses being unable to recover, whereas, and it follows a similar pattern amongst the Americans and the Germans. Equal concern, although it's spread across a slightly wide range, or across fears of a global recession. The US, less worried about banks failing, but more concerned about being able to pay their rent or their mortgage. And briefly, before we start going to questions, what I want to look at is the biggest lifestyle changes that the Brits plan to make as a result of their financial situation, as a result of lockdown, as a result of government guidance. But as you can see, that concern for local businesses translates into people, or 2/3 of people, going to support their local businesses much more. The question that we actually ask here is, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? And what we're seeing is levels of agreement. Next most popular in terms of action that people are going to take as soon as lockdown is over is, I can't wait to go on vacation or holidays overseas. So there is potentially some glimmer of hope there for the travel industry that is under extreme pressure at the moment. Anecdotally, what we've been hearing over the last several weeks is a reduction in people willing to use cash in the future. The concerns there being that it's a potential carrier of germs, of bacteria, of the virus, and therefore people will switch to more digital methods of payment. So 2/5 of people there saying that they will use cash less in the future. 1/3 of people saying that they're going to use more online shopping. That is particularly the case for younger age groups. There was a considerable noise in the media about people being more conscious of the environment as a result of this. What we're seeing is not that is the case amongst 1/3 of people saying that they will buy more green or sustainable products, but it's by no means across the board. There's also a feeling of people are going to take a more active part in their local community or volunteer work. Again, we're picking that up here, around 1/5 of people saying that they will take part in those behaviours. It's interesting if you compare that on against our benchmarks for the US and Germany. When our European business was presenting this chart yesterday to our European audience, lots of quips about the British weather and we can't wait to get overseas, whereas the Americans less likely to want to start traveling. But the US saying that they are much less likely to support local businesses, which is quite interesting there as well. So I'm going to, hopefully that gives you a very quick tour of what is in our COVID-19 consumer monitor, the new questions that we've added, but in terms of what's coming next, what you can expect from us. So there will be further webinars. We are running one in a couple of weeks' time where we have invited our colleagues from Imperial College London to give an update on the behavioural data that they are using for modelling purposes and that governments and public health organisations are using. That's going to give you a glimpse into how the scientists and policymakers are thinking. A couple of weeks after that, we're going to come back to you with, okay, these are the global narratives that we're seeing from our connected data. So please tune into that. And do keep an eye out on our public data as we develop more around that and push that out, including some interesting questions coming around the state of people's mental health. Before we go to questions, please, I do ask that if you do have anything, we see lots of questions coming in, please do enter them in the chat function and we'll get round to as many as possible. But if you do have any follow-up, if you do want to inquire about anything that we've mentioned today, please contact your local account manager in the first instance, or there is a generic email address, info@yougov.com, which is monitored 24/7 for people to come back to you on. So, on to your agenda, and we'll look to answer as many questions in a quick fire way as possible. So, Amelia, what's the first one that you've picked out from our chat, please?
Great. So what I want to do at the beginning, Will, is just ask you to talk a little bit about our panel. We've had quite a few questions around, you know, who takes part in our surveys, how do we ensure that it's representative? Do we do any checks on the panelist data quality, that type of thing? So if you could just give us a quick overview of what we have in place there around our panel, I think that puts us in a good place to then go into some of the detailed questions.
Sure, would be delighted. So, YouGov, the UK panel, from which all of the data that you've seen today, apart from, of course, the German and the US results, is drawn from our panel of about 1.8 million people. These are people that many of them have been with us for some time, but we are always feeding it as well with new blood. We do put stringent checks and balances on the data that we produce and put out, and that is reflected in the quality of the data that YouGov is famous for. In terms of panelist checks, for example, we are very good at wheedling out fraud within our panel, so that within any panel there is always an attempt to create multiple accounts. We can wheedle those out very effectively and do so. Within responses to surveys and questions, we eliminate or throw out responses from people that fail logic traps. For example, when someone registers with the panel, we ask their date of birth. Throughout their panel history, we ask for their age. If they are out by plus or minus 1, allowing for their birthday to fall either side of the survey date, then they are marked, their card is marked, as it were. We also always eliminate speeders from our data, so people that cannot possibly have read the question before they give an answer. We also look for patterns of response, so that if people are, for example, straight lining through a survey, always answering the first possible answer option, again, those people are marked and removed from our data. We also weight our data to ensure that it is representative of the population, using things like age, education, region, and so on. So what this data that we're playing back to you is high quality, representative of the population, that you should have every confidence in the data and what it is saying. Amelia.
That's great, thank you. We've also had just a lot of questions really that are asking for cuts in the data that are at a more granular level than what we have there. So we've got a lot of questions asking for our ability to cut things by postcode level, by local government area, also if we can look into sectors more. So all of these questions are good questions and we do have the answers to them. Will and mine's ability to find you those answers while we're actually on the webinar is very limited though. So for those of you who have a YouGov account manager, feel free to reach out to your account manager or client manager, and they'll be able to guide you through how we can cut this data down to a more granular level. If you don't have an account manager at YouGov, you can reach out, as Will said, either to the info line or to either of us, and we can also guide you through what it is that's available. Will, I think you had an earlier slide that just talked a little bit about where we were publishing the public data, what data tables were available, and so on. If we could just go back to that as well, because we've got quite a few questions around that. And I think if we could pop that up, that will give people the information they need about what they can access at the moment. But in general, our ability to cut down into these more granular levels. So, for our panelists, as Will said, we have this ongoing relationship with them. So we do collect data right down to a postcode level. All of the data that we report out though is aggregated data. So, our ability to cut down into those more granular levels really just depends on how many people we have. What's the sample size? Can we cut it down to that level while still ensuring the robustness of the data? So we encourage you to play around with it yourself if you want to. And also if you do have specific questions where you're looking for a particular answer or stat, feel free to reach out to us and we can see if we can do that for you. So, in general, the answers here are yes, we can understand more about who has had changes in online spending. We would be able to bring things down to, we had questions around if we can map it to things like Acorn, absolutely. And we can also look at things by different age breaks to the ones that we've shown here. So again, there's so many questions that are kind of variations on a theme around this. So also lots of questions around, can we get access to the presentation? Absolutely, we'll be sending out the presentation and a recording after this as well. So you're more than welcome to go through that. And if you, once you've looked at it in more detail, if you have more questions coming up, please let us know. There was also some questions in there around, do we have data on people's propensity to give to charity and so on. So in the economic monitor, Will showed some data there around people's intentions to volunteer more. But yes, we are also capturing a lot of information around how this is impacting the charity sector, both in terms of the immediate impact in terms of people's propensity to donate right now, and also how people are looking forward in terms of what they think that they will do in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amelia. Just to make it absolutely clear what is and is not in the public domain. So the slide that I've got on screen is referring to our public behavioral data. This is what is available at GitHub, and it is what data we are delivering to Imperial College London. You can download that there or visit the dashboard at coviddatahub.com. Then there is our tracking data that we have presented highlights from today. Elements of that tracking data are being made available on YouGov's website at yougov.com/free COVID-19 tracker. So that's selection. So for example, from the block 1, we published 4 questions from our tracker. The rest of the data is available to clients that subscribe to each of our 8-week blocks. So just to make that clear, 3 types of data: behavioral data that is freely available on GitHub or on the COVID Data Hub, our YouGov public data, which is available via our website, and our tracking data, which is available via subscription.
Thanks, Will. And we had a question as well from Lizzie Ellis, just asking about where we can see the data on the propensity to donate to charity. I would also recommend, along with looking at the free COVID tracker, we also are publishing a lot of content each day that draws on this data and other parts of our syndicated data set. So on our website, there's actually an article that we published on the 5th of May that talks about volunteering and propensity to donate, and has the data points that I was referring into it there. So very much encourage you to have a look at the resources that we've got on there if there are certain points that we've touched on today that you'd like to know more about, because we have been creating content on this very regularly as well.
Fantastic. I think there's only one other sort of specific question that I can answer just off the top of my head, and that's the one that's referring to hairdressing. Only because I was looking at that data this morning. We're tracking at the moment about 22% of people have DIY'd at home under lockdown. About a third of people say that they're not going to bother, and will wait till lockdown eases. I haven't got any more data on that at the moment, but Jess, we can follow up on that in the meantime. We're at time. So I'm going to draw this to a close, just to say thank you very much for attending and for all of your very detailed questions. And thank you very much to Amelia for her time and contributions to this morning. I'll leave Amelia to sign off, but from me is thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful bank holiday weekend.
Thank you, Will, and we really appreciate you joining, and the engagement has been fantastic. So as Will said, we are really continuing to look for ways to engage on this type of data. So keep your eye out for more webinars that we have, and the other content that we're pushing out. And we really appreciate you giving up your time this morning to join us. Thank you.